Okay. All right. Well, we took a break, but the conversation has been going on here in studio, and I was just winding up on that conversation about implementation of higher VAT on fuel, now at 16% from 8%. We're expecting that matter will be back in court on the 5th, which is the day after tomorrow, and we hope to get more direction. We also understand that the Attorney General could be considering appealing against that decision to stop the implementation of the Finance Act. So we'll be waiting to see what happens about that. But in the meantime, to the Salaries and Remuneration Commission and the President, they have not quite agreed on what should happen to CSs, the President and the Deputy. Watch.
Hiyo mshahara watu wanasema hakuna for now. Na hata nyinyi waziri tulizeni boli.
We are bound by the constitutional principles. So yes, we will receive all the views. We will consider them in the context of the 5 principles of pay determination.
All right. On this one, let me begin with you, Honorable Anthony Oluoch. What is this about? Because the SRC is saying that they had delayed review of salaries because of COVID some 2 years ago. Now it's time that they have to get back to it. But there's also the sensitivity that people are saying, I mean, life is getting unbearable for everyone else. Why should it be that those in government are getting better tidings?
I think it's a good thing, because you remember one of the key debates on our side that we had in Parliament about in opposition of the finance bill was that the cost of living had become unbearable. There was not a commensurate increase in salaries of the workers to cushion them against all these many tariffs, including the fuel, the housing, and now being told about NHIF increase and all that. A key component of our argument was that this was not timely, that even as we tried to improve the economy, we ought to have enabled Kenya to get to a place where the hard economic times have changed for them, their salaries have probably been increased, so that the SRC has now brought in that component of the debate on the table. So the question now is on the question of, should the executive be dictating to SRC when, how, to what extent, and to what parts of the population the increase should affect. And I think the main point that we need to be looking at here is whether this government actually respects the independence of institutions like it had said. And my answer is it does not. We have advanced the argument that Parliament itself is already under capture. Yeah? Capture to the extent that the numbers that ought to play a balance and give proper oversight on this government have already been compromised, so that you have laws being passed irrespective of its impact on the society. If you look at why in the Constitution we created independent offices, was to create another balance of power away from the other 3 arms of government. And you talked about separation of powers a while ago, where the legislature may be able to exercise part of the sovereign power donated to it by the people. The executive, to the extent that it has exercised that power in respect of court orders to balance what the executive has proposed, what Parliament has passed, judiciary exercises that power. So when SRC and independent institutions such as this one make decisions or exercises some of the roles that are placed upon them by the Constitution, it is not upon the chief executive of this country, the president in particular, to come in the process of that and tell them that, one, you cannot go on with this exercise, and if you go on with it, you can only implement it on this portion of the populace and on this. This is what I usually call executive conspiracy. And I'm not trying to say this to, because whenever it is you speak about members of parliament, they will always say, you know, members of parliament are very quick to want to increase their salaries. This is something this president has perfected. When he wanted to talk about housing, when the arguments were completely collapsing, he went back to his classic argument of the people who have and those who don't have, the hustlers versus the middle class. And now he started advancing the argument, these people don't want you to get a house, well, they already have a house. members of parliament have a mortgage, they don't want you to have a mortgage. So this argument is now surfacing here again, where the executive, and in particular the president, continuously wants to create a class society. If Salaries and Remuneration Commission, like now, Boundaries Commission is going to do its mandate, between 8 and 12 years, you must review boundaries. Salaries and Remuneration Commission is exercising its mandate to review salaries, which has nothing to do with class. Either we review the salaries because the cost of living has gone up for everybody, or we don't review them. But you cannot come and say that Sisi Wadosi, and in that you can clearly see that the target is a certain part of the society. And I'm not saying that I want an increase. It's not that I want an increase. But the president ought to allow the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, and I'm saying this even in respect of the former president. The SRC chair was never exercising their independence. Whenever it is they were making any decisions to gazette, there was always a call coming from somewhere and saying you cannot do this or you can do this. We ought to allow SRC to conclude what it does. Let this be challenged, and if you look at Article 95, the president does not make laws, the president can create policy. So I think the president should retreat to cabinet and say, in terms of our current status of the economy, we are trying to get to point A to B, let us have a cabinet paper and a policy that says that Salaries and Remunerations Commission should perhaps suspend for a time being a policy that can then come to Parliament for debate. Then late that report of the Salaries and Remuneration Commission in terms of Article 94.5, and this is what it says specifically, that nobody has the power to do anything that has the force of law other than Parliament. So on a roadside declaration, the president cannot come and take away what the Constitution has put on SRC, and which then, under Article 94.5, can only become law with Parliament, isn't it? So I think that the president should allow independent institution, and SSC is one of them, complete its job, let the debate go to its natural conclusion, which is Parliament, and then it becomes law. The president can only make policy at cabinet level and give general directions as the chief executive and say, where we are going, I want to persuade you that this is not correct now.
Oh, all right. Let's listen to, just hold on, I'll get to all of you. Let's listen to, let's listen to the president and the chair of SRC on some few more points of, should I say, disagreement?
We need to make sure that the gap between the person paid the least and the person paid the most is not too big, because we are all workers.
Remember that we are in the process of public participation. The president has a role as well in terms of giving the commission his views, his feedback. And therefore, we already actually, we did engage the presidency as well. And we have engaged other stakeholders. So in that capacity, he then gives us his feedback. He gives us his views. All other employing entities have done the same, and they are giving us that feedback. The other thing is the president also asked for specific information. You remember he said there is some information he requires from the commission. So we are okay to provide that information to him so that he can also give us his views on what we have proposed for state officers. So to that extent, that discussion from the president is in that context. He has asked for information, we shall provide. As the president, he will give us his views, his feedback, and it is his right as an appointing authority. Remember, for a number of state officers is the appointing authority. Okay? For others where he is not the appointing authority, we are also engaging their employing entities. They also will either write to us, ask for information, and by the way, we will have to give that information.
Okay. All right. That's the Chair of Salaries and Remuneration Commission, Lynn Mengich, talking about what the President has asked for. So, Honorable Kagusha, I mean, what do you make of this? Because yes, the President is the appointing authority, but he doesn't determine how much people should earn. I heard the Deputy President saying that for those cabinet secretaries who are uncomfortable with staying with the salaries they have at the moment, they're free to give their resignation letters. Isn't this intimidation, close to victimization? Why don't you just let, why don't they just let the SRC to do its job?
The President and the Presidency is not at war with SRC. Indeed, they appreciate and recognize the role, the key and pivotal role that SRC plays in ensuring that all Kenyans are sufficiently remunerated and also in accordance to their levels, their cadres, and also actually the law says that the review of the salaries then by SRC must be pegged on the economic growth. Probably one of the things that would be expecting to hear from SRC is a clear demonstration of how the economy has grown, so that then we can do this salaries review. I think what has been a problem and what I'm finding here as a challenge is the issue of the timing of these announcement of the increment of the salaries to especially the senior Kenyans or people who are in high cadres of authority. And that's also where I would also want to call out my brother here, Honorable Luch, who is quite an active member in Parliament. He's one of the people who I think stood most of the times when the finance bill was being made. But today...
What do you mean stood?
I mean, he had the mic and contributed a lot in Parliament. And had...
is that a compliment?
Of course it is.
Thank you.
It is. Yeah, because we have to appreciate those members who are also in Parliament and who make their contribution.
Yeah.
But again, also today I find, Honorable Oluoch, because I've listened to you a lot in Parliament, I find you quite contradicting yourself on the remarks that you are making on the TV, particularly on the issue of the President's position on this increment to people who are in higher cadres in this country. What I heard him say before is that we must ensure that we are cushioning Kenyans who are at lower cadres as against increasing salaries for those who are higher in the pay grade. And of course, what I also find SRC doing, by and large, is also adding fodder into the political rhetoric which is there about the people who are higher in office and those who are lower in office. And the other contradiction I also find here is the issue of that the President is trying to introduce class society, which himself, the President, is saying that we want to reduce the gap between...
Wait a minute. SRC is adding further to the political conversation. How so?
Definitely they are. You see, when we are talking about increasing taxes, and then SRC, you come the following morning and say increasing taxes, but to pay President more money, more salary. Are you getting? Honorable Luchi would be very happy about that. And here he will talk for the SRC, but on Sunday, in the public rallies, he will tell the as you can see, you are collecting your taxes and we are paying the President more salary. And that is why you see the contradiction that in Parliament, he will talk against increasing the taxes. Here, he will defend the SRC. But on Sunday, he will be against the SRC and against the salary, the salary increment. Nevertheless, the President is not introducing class society. What he's trying to do is to abolish the class society that we are. He's trying to ensure that the people who are lower in their pay grade actually can be able to catch up with those who are higher. And that's why he's talking about reducing...
Do you believe that's possible?
It's incrementally. It's possible that, for example, as members of Parliament, there's what we are being paid, which is equally to what the commissioners are also getting. I think actually commissioners should be getting a little bit much more than the members of Parliament. And you have people who are in that level the PSs, the cabinet secretaries, I think their pay is properly placed in terms of how much they are getting. What we need to do now is, if SRC really must increase the salaries, then they must be looking at people who are in the lower cadres, like the policemen, like the teachers, like the ECD teachers, and those people who are in those levels of pay. Those are the people who really need to get that increment, but not people who are really
That's what I'm asking you, because
higher.
at the moment, the minimum wage, I think, is about 15,120 shillings.
Yeah.
And the highest paid in public service is the president at 1.4 million shillings,
Yeah.
if you're not counting other allowances that are at his disposal.
Yeah.
Is there a day that you'll say that the gap between the 15,000 and 1.4 million has been reduced?
Of course.
How?
If you retain the 1.4 million at that, and then you increase the one which is lower from 15,000 to 25,000, for example, that gap has definitely been reduced. Are you getting? Yeah. You don't expect that a sweeper will be paid as much as a president. That, of course, will not happen. But the gap, the amount of money that is in between, can be reduced so that the donkey kind of is catching up with the horse to some extent. And you also remember that the pay that we get is also commensurate also to the roles and duties that you have and responsibilities, and also qualifications that you have. So you don't expect that someone who has a qualification of Form 4 and maybe with an entry grade of D- is going to be paid with a person who probably is at the level of PhD again. So when you're looking at the professors in the universities and you're looking at our teachers who are now well educated. So we are saying, look at those pay grades for the politicians and people who are in the commissions, people who are PSs, cabinet secretaries at that level. Let us also wait a little bit for those ones who are lower. But again, I'm also asking myself, have the SRC looked at the issue of the budget that has just been passed in the last 2 weeks? Because I do not think in the budget we were budgeting for these pay increases that the SRC now is proposing. So the proposals that SRC puts on the table must also be done in tandem with other bodies and other institutions and other agencies. For example, it's very important that the SRC looks at the budget that we are passing and makes their contribution not immediately after we have passed the budget, but before we have looked at the budget, so that then that can also be taken care of. And if you don't bring that in the right time, then it would also be confused or be taken to also be a political statement that you're issuing as a commission. And
but
having appreciated the independence of the commission, definitely.
I thought SRC was an independent commission.
It is independent.
They don't have to be guided by what Parliament is doing.
Well,
because then one wonders, then when you're raising some of the tax measures, did you look at the salaries of Kenya? So
but again, my brother, as we're looking at the issue of independence, you have also independence in terms of mandate. We've also to consider the issue of interdependence, depending on functions, because one function must be interdependent to the other. You cannot increase salaries without putting it in the budget.
Okay.
If you do that, then it will be a political statement. It will be in vain. In fact, we'll just then conclude that you're just adding fodder into the political statements that are flying all over. And yes...
No, Honorable Kawusha, I hear you. I want to hear from the other panelists here. Let me begin with you, Honorable John Mutunga. So is this well-intended, or is it just a populist move the president is making to say that wadosi watangoja, let's first address those at the lower...
First of all, we've had the SRC declare the process through which they go. SRC receives requests for improvement of salaries from the ministries, departments, and agencies. It is not the business of SRC to know whether they have a budget. It is the business of the SRC to rationalize the pay pack. Then they also use the principles she mentioned to try and determine what pay should go to individuals, and then release such a pay, of course, if the information received or request received from the MDAs is correct. So MDAs do the budget. It is upon them to decide whether they have cushioned any increment or not within the budget. Now, when it comes to SRC, Besides the request, there is a collective bargaining agreement which have been pending for a long time. So they also need to look at them and see which one can be implemented at whatever point in time. So reading from what is happening, there is also the president who is the symbol of unity, and he needs to play down some of these issues. And when the president makes a statement like, we have to wait for those of us, probably who are in the higher earning brackets, for us to pull up the others. And I want to say that this is a very patriotic statement. If you go to some countries, a family which is a one earning person in a family, if it's a single income family, they may not manage to hire a person to take care of their household issues in some of the developed countries. You see, we make a lot of noise in this country because we have a lot of things which are actually fairly cheap. Now, in those countries, you may not be able. One member of the family has to stay home and bring up the children because you cannot afford to get an extra person. Now, in Kenya, the determination of salary at the point of 15,120 for somebody who will go to Naivas or to other supermarkets where everybody else is going, to the market where we all go, to the petrol station everywhere, I think it's telling them to remain very far and down. And in line with the ASLA movement, and in line with the promises made, I believe that is why the president says we must push the people at the bottom of the pyramid to come up brief, because we can go to the same markets. We are confronted by the same issues. And we have been extremely obstinate in terms of this classism as a country. There are people who laugh on and they will go on and disappear in their own world. There are others who are struggling a lot and may not be able to make ends meet. So when I hear the two of them, and SRC is saying they are in the process of public participation. They are collecting views. And it's still, the one from the president is advisory. And he has requested for information. I believe this is the statement does not mean that is the end of the story. I believe this is a conversation that is ongoing, and at the end of the day, they'll strike a compromise. So finally, why do we propose salary increment? Government is the main employer in Kenya, as opposed probably to many other countries where we have private sector being the major employers. So when government determines the salary scheme, then government decides how the other institutions will also behave. Secondly, those employed in the government have got responsibilities and obligations. They have a lot to support behind them. So when the cost of living goes up, then that support is also curtailed in one way or another. So at the end of the day, it may be a good point for SRC to do what they are doing with respect to whether there is money from the MDAs as they are proposed or requesting them to do. So I find the two sides being very correct. And I don't want to revisit the Honorable Ndochi's issue because he really contradicted himself on this particular issue.
Which one?
I expected him to say the president is extremely positive this time around because he's saying no increment to the salaries. Because when you are saying you are talking for the last man, there is no way you can say, okay, increase salaries here, and then you people can. I don't think it is right. There is not creation of classism in that issue. There is actually destruction of the classes.
Honorable Mutunga, that's a very clever submission that you just made there. So you're siding with each of them, but really not saying what should happen. Because, I mean, Kenyans have spoken about that.
They have not finished. They have not. The process is ongoing. The determination has not been done. Nobody has been paid a cent.
Section 11, paragraph E of the Salaries and Remuneration Act talks about one of the functions of the Commission is to determine the cycle of salaries and remuneration review upon which Parliament may allocate adequate funds for implementation. Also, make recommendations on matters relating to the salary and remuneration of a particular state or public officer. Make recommendations in the review of pensions payable to holders of public offices, and of course perform such other functions as may be provided for by the Constitution. So already they have determined that their cycle is 4 years, and it's time now they are reviewing this. But still, to come back to Parliament for approval, it would appear. Basil, what do you make of this conversation, especially based on what the law provides versus what the President is doing? Is it justified? Is it populism, or he means it?
I think it's populism, to be straight, because it's a political gimmick where you tell the CRC increase salaries so that when I stand or when I go to the public debate, I tell them I'm going to reject. If you look at the president and the PS, the CS, the deputy president, Do you know they never incur cost of their fuel, the fuel of their cars? That is done by the government. They never incur cost on housing in terms of maintenance, workers, travel. All that is done by the government. So what about the low person? Because these new taxations actually affect the middle class and low income people. So when he says that I'm going to reject, it's a political gimmick, you know. So I don't think he's genuine. He says he wants to reduce the gap between the lowly paid, and the highly paid. You know?
Is it even possible?
Well, if you really meant it, if I tell you in terms of percentage, as I told you before, when Uhuru was leaving the government, diesel was actually retailing in Nairobi at 140 shillings. Ruto has made it at 179 shillings. So if you look at that percentage, that is 78% in terms of increment. Because 140 against 179 times 100%, that is 78%. So if you want...
What math is that?
No, you take 140 shillings. That was the retailing price when Uhuru was leaving office.
Yes.
The current retailing price is actually 179 shillings.
But it's also important.
So that's what I was saying. The increment was 40 shillings per litre. So if you do in terms of percentage, that is 140 of 179 times 100. That gives you what?
You cannot do that. What is that?
That's what I'm saying.
No.
but then
that is
also...
not...
Wait. Because if you look at 40 shillings...
Listen, Ngui,
yes.
Because the base figure is 140 shillings here.
Yes.
It has increased to 179.
That is 40
so
shillings.
The increment is 39 shillings.
Yeah.
So the percentage is 39 divided by 140.
140
times 100.
Yes.
It is not 78%.
No, ideally what I'm trying to say is, if you want really to cushion in terms of the economic dualism, the gap between the haves and the have-not, that's the lowly paid person and the highly paid person, then you need to increase their salaries in a reasonable manner. Because if you look at 15,120, that is the minimum wage. And the cost of living in everything is going to go up. From the school fees, from the medical care, from transport, from the basic commodities in household. So in principle, it is actually ironical to say that you're going to increase salaries at the same time, increase taxes at the same time, increase salaries. You better remain where we were and then increase or review salaries at that point, than increasing taxation and then try to come up with a new...
So you think SRC is wrong on this?
Well, I would say from my personal perspective, I don't think they need to do now currently they have to do it because there is new taxation. So with the new taxation, definitely they have to review salaries. But if we maintain taxes the way they were before, then at that point you can say they can consider reviewing salaries for the lowly paid people, not the highly paid people. But currently now, with the new taxes, they have to review across board.
So can
and that is on the same point,
yes.
And that goes again with what Honorable Lodge said. It's important for the executive to respect the independence of institutions. Because what we have, our constitution separating powers, if the executive...
I'm getting a lot of double speak here.
Just one point.
Are we being sincere?
Just one point. Just one point.
Yes.
I think, of course, the honorable member here is not being very sincere with his mathematics. First, what he's calculating is saying it's 78%. If you just use the figures that he is giving, it is actually 27%. If you give the figures that he's giving. But also important for him to know that is probably the worst example to use. That Uhuru Kenyatta left fuel at 140, now it has increased to 179. What he ought to tell us is that the subsidy that was given by the Uhuru Kenyatta administration that time was also not paid. It was borrowed and was also not paid. That now, the taxation that is going to be done, or that we are doing here, we are also carrying the burden of paying the subsidy of a whooping 21 billion Kenya shillings. And you have had government now negotiating with the fuel dealers to give it as a bond to government so that they can pay over a period of time. Because again, 21 billion Kenya shillings that was taken, never paid. And then of course, as we are talking, is also still being audited because there's also suspicion that quite an amount was also not going to the subsidy program itself. It was going into people's pockets. So that's why it's being held like this, doing a bit of investigations and audit. And so you cannot keep repeatedly using the example of Uhuru left and now it is. I mean, who is
but
going
we
to
are
be
looking
paying?
at, you know,
But
the reason
it was a lie. It was a lie.
Let me correct
it. It was a lie.
Okay.
It was a big lie, which we are now paying for now.
Just hold on. Honorable Kagushia.
Yeah.
So you're saying that we have a subsidy debt of 21 billion shillings.
Yes, indeed.
I thought the CS spoke about 25 billion shillings, but I mean, we can use that as a range.
You see, it's a figure that is a moving target. That's why it's being audited.
That's not the point.
Yeah.
I am saying we can use between 21 and 25. So once this subsidy has been cleared, are we going to see a reduction in fuel prices?
Now, what you're saying is this. What you're saying is that what the figures that our brother is giving here of 140, it was a huge lie. Because the amount that ought to have been retailing at was actually more than 140. And government pretended to have been paying for Kenyans, but never paid. Are you getting? It was passed on to the next government.
Saying, because
so it's now a debt. It's now a debt.
And it will be cleared at some point.
Yeah.
And you're saying that the price hikes you're saying is partly to go and pay that debt. So
I haven't really said that the reason for hiking that is to go and pay that debt. But I'm saying now, after hiking this, part of what you're going to pay using the resources you are collecting, the revenue you are collecting from that is going to be paying the debt.
Yeah, and that's the same thing I'm saying.
I get it. No, it is not actually. It's not exactly the same thing. We are not saying the reason why we are hiking is because of paying that debt. No. So
once it has been cleared, are you going to see any reduction in the fuel prices?
No, I think the reduction of fuel prices really is where you asked. And I really go with that, that the issue of the import declaration fee and the issue of railway development levy, I mean, the reduction of those ones really ought to be reflected. And I think really we as parliamentarians must also call upon the EPRA to give a detailed, and I want to hope they did, because they normally do. I want to hope they did, because they must also give a detailed analysis of how they are arriving at the new prices, as they have always done, so that we can be able to know this is how much is increasing due to this VAT declaration now, and how much is it also reducing as a matter of as reducing on the import declaration levy and the railway development levy. I mean, we must look at that. It's important so that it's clear to every Kenyan. And that one, I really agree with you. I agree with the Honorable Lucia, because we as parliamentarians must also be able to push these bodies to be as transparent as possible.
That's fine. I just wanted to... Because I'm looking at the calculations of EPRA here, and the import declaration fee and the railway development levy have remained as they were as of 14th of June. The IDF is still at 3 shillings 40 cents for petrol in Nairobi, and for railway development levy is still at 1 shilling 94 cents. So the reduction by Parliament through the Finance Act has not impacted on the prices here.
So could be then they obeyed the court order?
So they obeyed for those levies but didn't obey on VAT. Because the VAT changed from 13 shillings.
No, then they must change all the figures.
26.
Yeah, they must change all the figures.
Okay, all right. Probably they have an explanation. We'll be waiting to hear from them. Yes, you wanted to
yes. And
reply.
My two colleagues here think that I was contradicting myself. My point here is this, and to be fair, I think there is a good conversation going here with SRC. The first thing that we need to accept is that SRC advises government and sets regularly reviews the remuneration of state officers. Yeah, I think a better argument for the president to have advanced instead of the constant pitting, and that's my problem, the constant making of his case by pitting X versus Y. That's my problem. But I think there is a point in government raising the question, which I think should have been the better argument by government, that whatever it is that you are undertaking, and allow them to undertake it, yeah? Because under the principles, if you look at what are the principles that SRC ought to take into account when reviewing, they need to ensure that the total public compensation in terms of remuneration is physically sustainable. And I think that's the point that you're making, that the question of timing when we are trying to pull the country out of this economic point would come into play. And the issue of the gap that the president is bringing then can combine. So that point is made, and that point I do accept. The only problem I have, which I think the chair ably demonstrates, is that We are in a process. Please allow us to complete it. The presidency is part of the public participation that we have already engaged. Yeah? We have sought the views of the presidency, and if there are clarifications, we can issue them. So I think that space ought to be allowed for SRC. And remember, SRC only advises. It sets the upper limit and the lower limit. And then it is up to the executive, taking into account fiscal sustainability, to then decide how this works out. The last point that I want to make on this is, and I want to disagree with the points that have been made, that there are persons who are appointees of the president, and therefore the president, these people are answerable to the president. The president appoints certain people to the Salaries and Remunerations Commission. So does the parliament, isn't it? So does the Public Service Commission. But once they arrive at the commission, they cease to be appointees of either of these entities and become independent office holders. They are accountable to the people of Kenya. And I would like that the SRC proceeds with his mandate, taking that into account, and the president also proceeds with his overall bird's eye view that whatever you do must be sustainable. Take into account that these people are also independent. That's the point that I was trying to make.
So on
just hold on. Let's listen to what the SRC chair said about pay disparities.
Our policemen, our people serving in the military space, people working in government offices, we have agreed that because of where we are today.
We also looked at another survey which we don't compare ourselves with because it is looking at the big multinationals, very competitive environment. Their CEOs earn over 5 million. And therefore, when we speak about the pay of a president at 1.6, then we must therefore put it in context as a country. And say if CEOs in the private sector at the middle level, not the highest level, are at 3 million, and the highest actually goes up to 7 million. We have that data. So when we then look at a president at 1.6, it's important to have the context that the pay in the public sector is not aiming at taking pay to the highest level. It is looking at 50th percentile of a very conservative market.
All right. Honorable Basil, what do you get from that, that the SRC chair is talking about, also reflecting on why she doesn't necessarily believe that a president or those in top offices are necessarily paid as much?
You know, what the SRC, I think she's failing to understand. One, of course, we need to look at as I indicated below, the cost of living in the country. As I calculated, if the increment in terms of cost of living is at 29%, you also need to review salaries to reflect 29%. It's not just a matter of coming up with figures, but looking at the reality on the ground. That's what I would say basically.
Okay. All right. I want us to transition to a different topic. John Mutunga, you have something to add?
No.
Okay, all right. I want us to transition because